The date was October 23, 1944. In the dark forests of Belgium near the German border, Wehrmacht soldiers huddled in their defensive positions. These were hardened veterans, men who had fought across Europe, from the frozen steppes of Russia to the deserts of North Africa. They had seen the best and worst that war could offer. They had faced British regularity, Soviet brutality, and now they waited for yet another American unit to test their mettle. But something felt different this time. The intelligence reports filtering through German headquarters spoke of a new American division. The 104th Infantry Division, they called themselves, the Timberwolves. Fresh troops from the United States, never tested in combat. The German officers smiled. Green American soldiers, probably farm boys and factory workers who had never seen real war. This would be easy. They had broken American units before. What these German soldiers did not know was that these Timberwolves were commanded by a man they would soon learn to fear. A man whose very name would become a warning whispered among Wehrmacht troops in the darkness. The Germans did not yet know his face. They did not know his voice. And most of them didn't yet know his reputation. But rumors travel faster than bullets. Somewhere, an older sergeant muttered that he had heard of this commander before. Somewhere in Africa. Somewhere where American troops who were supposed to collapse instead fought like wolves. The front line quieted. Mist rolled through the trees, and German officers waited confidently for dawn. Sure, they would scatter another inexperienced American formation like wheat before the scythe. But before long, they would learn a terrifying truth. These were not ordinary Americans. These men were the creation of a general who didn't fight wars on paper, but wars in blood and mud. His name was Terry Allen, and before the sun rose, the Germans would understand why his enemies didn't just fight him. They feared him. Before the Germans ever learned his name, before reports began describing him as reckless, unpredictable, and dangerously effective, Terry Allen had already lived a life that prepared him for the kind of war Europe was about to become. He was not like other American generals. Not polished, not aristocratic, not molded by West Point tradition like Patton or Bradley. Terry Allen was chaos wrapped in discipline, instinct wrapped in defiance. Born in 1888 to an Irish Catholic cavalry officer, he grew up in an atmosphere where toughness wasn't taught. It was expected. He entered West Point, but unlike the legendary names who passed through its halls with immaculate discipline, Allen barely survived it. He was rebellious, defiant of authority, constantly punished for breaking rules. He graduated dead last in his class in tactics, the irony of which history would later savor. But there was something the academy couldn't measure. The ferocity of spirit. The instinct to lead men, not columns on a parade ground. He didn't want soldiers to pose. He wanted soldiers who could bleed and still push forward. From the first moment he took command in the field, it was clear. Terry Allen was born for the front line, not the conference table. Where other generals believed in doctrine, he believed in survival. Where others lectured from a rear tent, Allen walked the mud among his men. He made a point never to look cleaner, safer, or more comfortable than the soldiers he commanded. If they slept in foxholes, so did he. If they marched in freezing rain, he refused shelter until the worst of it was behind them. He didn't command respect. He earned it, and soldiers felt it instantly. Before Europe, before Belgium, before the Timberwolves, there was North Africa, where American troops were humiliated in their first major land battles. Poorly coordinated, inexperienced, stunned by German tactical brutality. The U.S. Army risked becoming a battlefield embarrassment. It was there that Allen first became a threat. It was there that his doctrine, fight like you mean to survive, was born. But his attitude made him enemies inside his own army long before it made him a legend among the men. The traditional American generals, the textbook commanders, despised him. He didn't stand straight at briefings. He didn't wear his uniform pristine. He swore, laughed, disobeyed etiquette, and refused to babysit paperwork more than a battlefield. And worst of all in their eyes, he encouraged his men to think for themselves, not to wait for orders, not to follow procedure blindly, but to outfight the enemy in real conditions. To Eisenhower's generals, he was undisciplined. To the men who fought for him, he was the only kind of leader worth following. And this is why the Germans would soon fear him. Not because of how he fought on a map, but because of who he turned soldiers into. He gave Americans something they had never possessed in Europe before, an offensive identity. Before Allen, U.S. infantry was reactive. After Allen, it was predatory. Before long, German intelligence would stop laughing at those inexperienced farm boys, because Terry Allen had a way of turning ordinary men into relentless fighters. But that transformation didn't happen overnight. It began with a broken division, and a commander who refused to accept weakness. The forests around Inden erupted to life. At precisely 02:47 hours, before most German sentries had even rotated their watch, Allen's wolves were already inside their perimeter. There was no mass bombardment to warn them. No preliminary artillery to tip off defenders. Just the sudden flash and thunder of coordinated grenades, automatic fire stitched through machine gun nests, and razor-sharp maneuvers executed with terrifying precision. The Germans were disoriented instantly. They had expected hesitation, fear, that slow creeping advance most inexperienced American units favored. Instead, they saw motion, fast, violent, deliberate motion. Timberwolves didn't probe defenses. They ripped them open. The first German squad to respond was swallowed before they could even chamber a counterattack. One survivor would later write in his diary that the Americans moved as if they were hunting us, not engaging us. That was not an accident. In training, Allen had drilled into his soldiers that hesitation gets men killed. Better to move fast and wrong than slow and dead. The Germans were still trying to identify the direction of the assault when Allen's second wave hit from the flank, collapsing a fallback route before it could even be used. By 03:10, German command posts were in chaos, officers shouting orders into radios that were already cut off, calling artillery batteries that could not confirm targets, desperate for a picture of the battlefield that no longer existed. Their maps were void now. The front line wasn't crumbling, it was gone. Inside the confusion, one of Allen's lieutenants radioed back. Timberwolf actual. Objective 1 neutralized. We're inside their wire. Allen didn't celebrate. He didn't even acknowledge the message. He simply looked to the next objective. There were 2 more villages between the 104th and the main German fortifications. Most commanders would pause, consolidate, reinforce supply lines. Allen didn't believe in pauses. Pauses gave the enemy time. Push through, he ordered. Timberwolves weren't fighting a holding action or a careful advance. They were conducting a relentless hunt. The night favored them. Allen had trained his men to own the darkness, to turn fear into fuel, and now it paid off. They advanced under black skies without tripping over themselves or losing cohesion. German doctrine had taught that nighttime belonged to confusion and defensive reflex. Allen flipped that doctrine on its head. As they moved, German counterfire stiffened. Mortars began dropping, machine gun teams repositioned, and retreating infantry tried to stall the advance. But every time the Germans found their footing, the Timberwolves hit harder. One scouting platoon slipped behind a German company that had set up a killing zone along a road and annihilated them from the rear. Another infiltrated a farmhouse radio post and seized the German transmission codes before destroying the equipment entirely. By 04:20, German resistance was no longer tactical, it was survival. Veteran Wehrmacht troops, men who had held against the Soviet juggernaut in Belarus and stopped armored thrusts in Italy, were now abandoning fortified positions because they believed they were being encircled by a force twice its actual size. That was Allen's genius. He didn't just want fire superiority. He wanted psychological collapse. He wanted the enemy second-guessing everything. Reports flooded higher German command headquarters. New American tactics. Highly coordinated nighttime assault. Unusual discipline under fire. The phrase that appeared in one radio dispatch would later become legend. These are not green Americans. By dawn, Inden was no longer a fortress. It was a carcass picked clean. And as the Germans retreated deeper toward Eschweiler, one question began circulating among their ranks. Who was leading these Americans? They expected a West Point-bred officer, polished and doctrinal, someone predictable. What they got instead was Terry Allen, a commander who fought with teeth bared and had no interest in choreography when brutality and speed would do. And this was only the opening strike. The Germans had not yet met Allen face to face, but his shadow was already on their backs. By morning, captured German officers were already whispering his name, Allen. They said it with a mix of confusion and anger, the anger of professionals who had just been outclassed by a force they had been told was inexperienced. The Wehrmacht was not accustomed to humiliation. They had broken armies across continents. They had forced surrenders from veteran units. Yet this American commander had done in a single night what most divisions achieved in a week. He shattered the illusion of German control. Allen didn't stand back and watch from a headquarters tent. He rode forward, moving among his units with that same unshakable calm that unnerved even his own junior officers. He walked the front lines like a man inspecting fencing posts on a ranch. Not a battlefield smeared with smoke and corpses. Men straightened when he appeared, not from ceremony, but from the energy he carried with him, a certainty that they were not enduring the fight. They were owning it. His command style was brutal in its simplicity. Don't stall. Don't wait. Don't let the enemy breathe. When his engineers reported they needed more time to clear a fortified roadblock, Allen didn't wait. He rerouted through terrain the enemy assumed was impassable. Where a more traditional commander looked for perfect conditions, Allen looked for momentum. He was gambling and winning. Meanwhile, in the German command bunker outside Eschweiler, the mood had changed. The arrogance was gone. The phrase "untested Americans" had vanished from conversation. Officers now discussed the division as if it were a veteran panzer unit with years of combat experience. Multiple German reports mistakenly estimated the 104th strength at nearly double its actual manpower. Allen had not just broken their line, he had broken their perception. By midday, reconnaissance confirmed the Germans were pulling more reinforcements into the region. Not to attack, but to plug the hole Allen had just torn open. That was the mark of a commander inside the enemy's decision cycle. They weren't dictating the fight anymore, he was. But the most chilling revelation came from intercepted German transmissions. That intelligence soon passed to Allen's staff. If the Timberwolves are operating in the sector, do not engage at night unless reinforced. The enemy was already rewriting its doctrine. That night, Allen moved again, not giving them a second to reset. His men pushed toward Eschweiler, slipping through the shattered remains of the forest perimeter like wolves chasing wounded prey. Germans tried to stage a defensive stand along a series of ridgeline trenches. Under a cautious commander, this might have bought them hours, maybe even a day. Under Allen, it bought them 28 minutes. Once again, he bypassed the obvious route, sending a flanking unit through thick brush and shale that intelligence maps had marked as non-navigable terrain. The Germans never saw it coming. From the ridge, panic bloomed. Officers screamed orders. Flares shot into the sky. Machine guns rotated wildly, searching for ghosts in the dark, and then the Timberwolves were already behind them. The route of retreat was sealed before they understood it had even been threatened. Survivors later reported the same unnerving sensation. Not that they were fighting Americans, but that they were being hunted by them. The psychological toll was exponential. Hardened German sergeants told young conscripts not to fall asleep on night watch because the Timberwolves prefer the darkness. The myth had begun. But myths, like storms, grow fast. The Germans still hadn't seen Allen's most devastating tactic. They still believed this was the peak of his ferocity. They were wrong. This was only the approach. The real blow was still forming, and when it landed, German command would finally understand why the 104th did not wait to fight another day. Because under Terry Allen, the night belonged to him. By the third night of continuous advance, even American high command was stunned. The 104th Division had done something rare in Western Front warfare. They were accelerating under fire instead of slowing down. Allen's division wasn't grinding through the German line. It was slicing it apart like a hunting animal tracking blood. And that was exactly how Allen wanted it. Where other U.S. commanders feared nighttime fighting, Allen lived in it. His men slept during the day when possible, advanced under moonlight, and struck when the Germans were disoriented. It was a reversal of everything the Wehrmacht expected from the Americans. The Germans had written countless field manuals about American daytime artillery dominance. Not night maneuver, not silent infiltration, not this relentless, spectral pressure that never seemed to lift. In German field reports, a new chilling term started appearing. Die Nachtjäger, the night hunters. The Germans weren't just losing ground. They were losing confidence. They began overestimating enemy positions, fortifying the wrong ridgelines, pulling back prematurely. Not because they were beaten militarily, but because they were bleeding psychologically. Allen understood a truth that would later be taught in modern doctrine. A retreating enemy is halfway defeated before you ever reach him. He intended to finish the other half. Allen's method, controlled chaos. Allen's genius wasn't wild aggression. It was disciplined brutality disguised as unpredictability. He didn't throw waves of soldiers into fortified gun nests like some reckless butcher. Instead, he struck from angles that forced the enemy to collapse on their own fear. Most commanders looked for safe approaches. Allen looked for surprising ones. His staff officers used to joke, the shortest road to the target is whatever road the enemy thinks we're too dumb to take. He trained the Timberwolves for mobility first, courage second, and lethality third. Because speed without fear breaks an enemy's planning cycle long before bullets land. The Germans realize who they're facing by late October. German intelligence finally traced command of the 104th Division back to Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen, the same commander who had turned the 1st Infantry Division the big red one, into a wrecking ball in North Africa and Sicily before being reassigned. They had not misjudged a new American commander. They were staring down an old nightmare. Reborn, surviving Africa Corps veterans immediately recognized the name. Some remembered the desert battles. Some remembered being overrun at night. Others remembered that Allen didn't just take ground. He took initiative out of the enemy's hands. The Wehrmacht had respected Patton. They had feared Bradley's logistics. They had braced for Montgomery's artillery. But Allen was different. Allen got inside your war. He made you fight on his timeline, not yours. And worst of all for the Germans, he never gave you time to recover. A new phase begins as the Timberwolves push toward the industrial belt near Eschweiler. Allen prepared to unleash his most dangerous maneuver yet, a multi-pronged night assault designed not just to capture ground, but to break the cohesion of the German defensive system entirely. To the enemy, holding the line was still a tactical objective. To Allen, shattering morale was the objective, because once the will to stand collapsed, bodies followed. The Germans were about to learn that Allen didn't just defeat units, he unstitched armies. The night assault that would define Allen's legend didn't begin with a trumpet, or a blazing artillery barrage, or tanks roaring through the dark. It began with silence, the most unnatural condition on a battlefield. Past midnight, the Timberwolves moved like shadows through the forested ridgelines overlooking the German fortifications. No radio chatter, no cigarette glow, no metallic clatter of canteens. Allen had drilled them again and again. Noise discipline is survival. To an observer, it wouldn't look like thousands of men advancing. It would look like the land itself was quietly shifting forward, and below them, in the tree-lined bunkers and farmhouses reinforced with concrete and steel, the Germans waited for the attack they believed would come at dawn, when Americans always attacked. But dawn was 6 hours too late. Allen knew what the enemy relied on: predictability. He would starve them of it. The signal at 0247, a single red flare cracked upward from a forward scout team. The prearranged signal. The night erupted. Thunderous cupped artillery, not saturation bombardment, but precision shock strikes, slammed the German communication centers, mortar pits, and rear ammunition stores. Allen didn't want to flatten the line, he wanted to blind it. German machine gunners scrambled, disoriented, helmets half-fastened, uniforms half-buttoned, suddenly fighting a war that had begun earlier than their nerves were prepared to endure. Then the Timberwolves arrived. They didn't advance in a straight wave like traditional U.S. infantry. They splintered, advancing in broken angles and crescent shapes, cutting the defense apart as much psychologically as physically. Every gun nest found itself suddenly attacked from 2 directions, sometimes 3. The Germans fired blindly. The Americans fired deliberately. This was not chaos. This was designed panic. Allen's presence, Terry Allen, was not at headquarters behind a map. He was forward with a field telephone strapped over his shoulder, crawling along dirt embankments, personally checking the momentum of the push. Soldiers who later wrote memoirs described seeing him wading through smoke and shellfire like a man physically allergic to cover. "Move like wolves," he shouted through the dark. Not cattle, wolves. For many soldiers, this was their first real test. Green troops fresh from the States, now thrust into a night battle that would determine the fate of their reputation. Maybe even the fate of their division. But Allen had built something inside them before this night ever came. Permission to be dangerous. The German collapse begins. By 0415, the first cracks appeared in the line. German runners attempted to relay orders to retreat to secondary fortifications, but the American assault teams had already overrun the relay routes. In command bunkers, officers screamed into dead radios, unable to reach artillery support or reserve units. Cut off. Surrounded. Disoriented. The Timberwolves weren't pushing them back. They were dislocating them, severing the mind of the defense from its limbs. Some German units surrendered early, not because they lacked ammunition, but because they lacked certainty that a defense still existed behind them. And that was the point. The moment the legend took form. When the Germans finally understood who they were fighting, it wasn't from a captured helmet or a dog tag, it was from the behavior of their enemy. "There is only one American general who fights at night like this," a German officer wrote later. "Only one who moves like a raiding wolf pack instead of an army. It must be him, Terry Allen, the same ghost from North Africa, back again." And this time, he wasn't just here to win terrain, he was here to crush belief. By morning, the battlefield did not look like a normal American victory. There were no piles of abandoned equipment on roadsides, No chaotic scramble of overextended U.S. lines. No delayed follow-through. What lay spread across the ridgeline were silent German positions, weapons still pointed outward, foxholes intact, machine gun belts still loaded, but the men who once defended them had vanished, surrendered, or retreated before they ever had a chance to truly fight. That was the moment German field commanders understood this wasn't a division advancing a TSO. This was a hunting pattern, because armies can defeat opponents in one of two ways, by destroying bodies, or by destroying the will to resist. Allen preferred the second one, because it killed the spirit, not just the soldier. Word spreads through German lines in the villages behind the front. Messengers arrive breathless, frantic and contradicting each other. They don't stop. They don't wait for daylight. They move like raiders. They're already behind us. Rumors always outrun truth in war, and Terry Allen let the rumors do half his work. By afternoon, Wehrmacht battalion leaders were whispering the name, der verrückte Wolf General, for the Mad Wolf General. To the Americans, he was a commander. To the Germans, he was becoming a phenomenon. Inside Allen's mind, while fear spread behind German lines, Allen held a simple map on his knee, marking new assaults by hand. He wasn't celebrating. He was pressing. There was a phrase he drilled into every officer. Momentum is a living thing. If you don't feed it, it dies. Other commanders attacked until they hit resistance, then paused to reorganize. Allen attacked until resistance began, then accelerated. He didn't want the enemy to fight back organized. He wanted them reacting disorganized. To his staff, he said quietly, "We are not here to break through a line. We are here to break through their confidence." Fear becomes a force, multiplier. Even German artillery crews, usually the most disciplined, began pulling their guns too early, terrified of being overrun in the next night strike. Their early withdrawals left infantry unsupported, confused, exposed. It wasn't Allen's rifles that were winning the battlefield. It was Allen's psychology. Once fear becomes the battlefield partner of an enemy, every bullet hits twice, once in the body, once in the mind. The Timberwolves believed too, and while German soldiers whispered out of dread, American soldiers whispered out of awe. This was the moment Allen's division shifted from inexperienced troops into believers. They no longer needed to ask whether they could win. They had seen how fear itself was on their side. They began to see themselves the way the Germans were now seeing them, not as defenders of ground, but as predators of weakness. And by the way, if you're enjoying this story so far, pause for just a second and tell me in the comments, where are you watching this from? Your country? Your city? I love seeing how far these We Too stories travel across the world. And if you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe for more deep dive war stories like this one. Because the next moment in this campaign is where Allen becomes truly terrifying. What happened over the next 48 hours was not a battle. It was an unraveling. German defenses that had been carefully dug, fortified, reinforced, and prepared for months now collapsed in days. It wasn't from lack of ammunition or lack of manpower, but lack of nerve. The German officers tried to rally counterattacks, but every time a battalion was assembled, American scouts were already probing its flanks. Before they could mount a defense, they were already reacting again. No rhythm, no breathing room, no psychological footing. Allen had stolen something from them that military textbooks rarely quantify, but every veteran understands: the feeling of having agency in a fight. Once that's gone, the battlefield ceases to feel like a contest. It feels like a sentence. Prisoners give the game away. When interrogators questioned German soldiers captured during the push, a pattern emerged. These weren't green troops collapsing. These were long-serving veterans from the Eastern Front and Africa. They weren't afraid of Americans in general. They were afraid of this American. Some prisoners refused to believe the 104th Division were fresh troops. One German NCO spat in disbelief. New troops don't attack at night. New troops don't flank like water finding cracks in stone. This is a knife fight, not an advance. Another officer, exhausted and shaking, simply asked, "Is it true? Is Allen back?" The psychological wound from North Africa had reopened. The same ghosts who had hunted them through the desert were now stalking them in the forests of Belgium. Supply lines can't keep up. Allen's biggest enemy wasn't the German army. It was his own success. The Timberwolves moved so quickly that supply trucks struggled to keep pace. Fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, everything had to be rerouted on the fly because Allen's division refused to slow down to a normal tempo. To most commanders, This would be dangerous recklessness. To Alan, it was worth every gamble. He didn't want just enough pressure. He wanted suffocating inevitability. He knew the Wehrmacht didn't fear American firepower. They had seen artillery before. What they feared now was relentlessness. The point of no return by early November. The Germans could no longer rotate units in or out to stabilize their line. Relief divisions arrived already demoralized by rumor and retreat reports. Veteran sergeants were watching their men crack before first contact was even made. The Wehrmacht had seen powerful generals. They had never seen a general who weaponized speed and psychology together so ruthlessly. This was the moment Terry Allen stopped being a problem and became a legend inside the enemy's mind. Just a simple check-in. And as this story spreads across borders, I'm curious. Where in the world are you watching from? Which country? I always find it fascinating how WOTA stories echo differently depending on who hears them and from where in the world they hear them. The shift from here forward. The German command no longer planned offensively in the region. They weren't asking, where do we strike? They were asking, where will Allen strike next? That difference, that reversal of initiative, is the real reason fronts collapse. When an army stops thinking about victory and starts thinking about survival, strategic defeat becomes only a matter of time. And they were about to learn just how unforgiving Allen could be once an enemy started running. Because a predator does not just chase, a predator finishes. By the time the Germans attempted to form a coherent fallback line near Eschweiler, their defensive doctrine was already broken. The map still showed positions. The officers still spoke in tactical terms. But their units were no longer thinking like defenders. They were thinking like prey, and Allen could smell it. The average general, seeing the enemy pull back, would consolidate, reinforce, dig in fresh positions, and prepare a methodical follow-up. Allen did the opposite. He refused to give the Germans a chance to reform. He intended to hit them while they were still gasping for equilibrium. He gathered his regimental commanders and laid it out with characteristic bluntness. They're not retreating to survive. They're retreating to remember how to be soldiers. We don't give them that chance. The second night strike. Most soldiers expect only one nighttime assault in a 72-hour period. Fatigue alone makes two nearly impossible. But Allen wasn't fighting with doctrine. He was fighting with momentum. He knew if he struck again before they recovered from shock, the Germans wouldn't just lose the town. They would lose their will to contest the next one. So the Timberwolves moved again. Before dusk, troops were already repositioning for a fresh infiltration. Scouts identified gaps where retreating German units had not yet been reinforced. Allen fed whole battalions through those cracks like water, forcing open a fracture in rock. This time, there was no artillery signal. No flare. No warning. The Germans saw them only when shadows became rifles. Panic turns into disorganization. German junior officers tried desperately to form last-minute firing lines, but their men were exhausted, demoralized, disoriented by the lack of sleep and the constant threat of being surrounded. Some units fired wildly. Others held fire entirely, unsure whether Americans were already behind them. In a war ruled by coordination, Allen had forced the Germans into the one condition where armies die fastest: uncertainty. Entire squads surrendered not because they were cornered, but because they believed they already were. This is the difference between losing a fight and losing a sense of control. Allen's presence at the front again, as if he had no concept of fear or personal safety. Allen was forward, crouched behind shattered stone walls, boots muddy, coat unbuttoned, issuing orders like a mob boss orchestrating a street ambush. His radio men nearly tackled him twice, trying to drag him out of exposed positions. He brushed them off with the same line every time. If they see me forward, they stay forward. Leadership by proximity, not performance review. To his men, Allen wasn't a general. He was evidence that they could push further. German breakdown. Within hours, the fallback line wasn't bending, it was splintering. Some German units abandoned heavy weapons just to move faster. Others dug in irrational positions, facing the wrong direction. Terrified Allen's men were already behind them. It no longer mattered where the Timberwolves were. It mattered where the Germans thought they were. And at that point, Allen had already won. Because in war, belief always travels faster than bullets. Why the Germans feared him not, because he had more men. Not because he had bigger guns, but because he broke the one rule all armies rely on to function. The belief that tomorrow will be a fight, not a hunt. Once the Germans began to feel hunted, the battle was no longer fair. The second nighttime assault had not just shattered their defenses, It shattered their identity as soldiers. By the time the smoke cleared and the last German holdouts were rounded up, the front in that sector had ceased to function as anything resembling a defensive formation. It wasn't a retreat anymore. It was a disintegration. And the lesson echoed across the German command structure. There were American generals who could be resisted, but Terry Allen was not one of them. He was not a man who took ground. He was a man who removed certainty. Word of the Timberwolves spread faster than their own advance. Civilians overheard retreating German officers muttering about a general who attacked in darkness like a hunter who never sleeps. One captured courier report even warned headquarters that units should avoid night contact with Allen's division unless already prepared for collapse. That sentence was the real victory. Not the town they took, not the line they breached, but the fear that crossed ahead of them, arriving days before their boots did. The Germans had faced Patton's tanks, Montgomery's attrition, Bradley's logistics. But Terry de la Mesa Allen? He was something different. He was the general who taught the Wehrmacht that fear could march just as relentlessly as infantry. A man whose enemies didn't fear losing to him. They feared meeting him. And in a war defined by steel and blood, he fought with something far more devastating, psychology sharpened into a weapon. His men would later say he didn't just command a division, he unleashed one,